Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about the most important constellations that everyone should be going for passively over time, mainly for 4-star characters, talk about the ones that everyone needs for their accounts, and then also some more niche ones if you play certain characters, talking about the best ones for them, mainly for 4 stars, although I will briefly mention some 5-star constellations that I think could be worthwhile. But obviously don't feel forced to spend for constellations or anything, I'm just highlighting the most important ones. But before we begin, I do have the pleasure of telling you guys that this video is actually sponsored by a game that I have genuinely played and enjoyed for quite some time, and that game is Smite, featuring an all-new battle pass introducing Transformers characters to the game. In case you don't know, Smite is a free-to-play third-person action MOBA that lets you play as mythological gods and icons like Hades, Loki, and Ares. And so now, not only can you be a god, but with this season's battle pass, you can also be a Transformers character like Optimus Prime, Megatron, or Starscream. Not only that, but you can also download and play this game for free, as Smite is a free-to-play game, and it's also available on many platforms such as PC, Xbox One, PS4, Switch, and also Amazon Luna. It's a game that's been around for a while, so there's a huge community of dedicated players, allowing you to always jump in a match rapidly and find people to play with. Personally, I think this crossover is insane because being able to switch from an ancient mythological god like Hades to a Transformers character like Megatron is crazy to me, and I can't wait to try it out with you guys. Be sure to click the link in the description to download Smite for free on all the platforms that I mentioned, being PC, Xbox One, PS4, Switch, and Amazon Luna. Alright, so with the intro out of the way, let's start talking about the best constellations for your account. Now, while I promise this video will have some lesser known ones, I am going to start with the most obvious one, which is Bennett's first constellation. The reason I have to talk about this is because I believe Bennett's first constellation is one of the best constellations in the game, one of the best C1s at least in the game, because not only is Bennett just an amazing unit, but this C1 elevates his power by allowing him to buff your active character with attack when they're inside of his field, inside of his burst, regardless of their HP. So if you don't know, at C0, Bennett will heal, and then when they're above 70% HP, he'll start giving you attack. But with this constellation, he'll always give you attack, and on top of that, it will also give you 20% more of Bennett's base attack, which is absolutely huge, especially if you're running a high base attack weapon. Gaining another 20% of his base attack, which for my Bennett at level 80 is 852, getting that extra roughly 170 attack is very nice and a big DPS increase. Another big upside with something like Bennett C1 is that it is his first constellation, so it's very accessible, and Bennett's also available in the Star Glitter shop every couple of months since it does rotate, so it is definitely a constellation you can save your Star Glitter for. Another obvious one that I want to get out of the way, but nonetheless a very, very important one, is Xiangling's 4th constellation. Now, I am someone who believes that Xiangling is a very powerful carry even without your 4th constellation, but it is one that will significantly increase your DPS by increasing your Pyronado's duration by 40%, which is amazing, honestly, because the Pyronado is the main source of your Xiangling's damage, and this constellation will make it go from 10 seconds to 14 seconds, leaving you with only a 6-second downtime on your burst, which is very, very nice. Now, since we're talking about constellations that will significantly increase your DPS, an obvious one that I have to mention as well, similar to Xiangling, is Beidou. Beidou's 2nd constellation, and honestly, Beidou's constellations as a whole, like her C2, 5, and 6, are very powerful, but Beidou's 2nd constellation especially, since it's so early in like her constellations, and since it's her strongest one, is one that I think you should definitely go for if you want to play Beidou. While it isn't a needed constellation, it will significantly increase your DPS, allowing your Stormbreaker to jump between 2 additional targets. And as you guys know, I'll put numbers on screen, I've put these before in previous videos, but Beidou at C2 against 2 enemies will just have like the highest scaling in the game, dealing insane amounts of damage, and even against more than 2 enemies, Beidou is still good, especially with this constellation, because her burst will be bouncing between them and dealing massive amounts of damage with her already ridiculous scaling on every discharge. Now, while this video is mainly going to be focusing on the earlier constellations, or at least try to recommend those more, since I can't say everyone should go for C6 Beidou, obviously, I will also point out the later constellations that are good, like Beidou's C5 and 6, but C2 being the most important one. Similarly, for a character like Xingqiu, Xingqiu has just good constellations overall. Honestly, he has some of the best, if not the best, like overall constellations for a 4-star character. Definitely up there, because most of his constellations are just amazing. Now, his worst one is actually his first one, which is unfortunate since this only increases your like defensive capabilities. Gaining that rain sword doesn't actually increase your damage, but it only increases the rain swords around you that sort of protect you, give you that damage reduction, and heal you. Whereas your other constellations are offensive and really will increase your damage. Your C2 is amazing because it decreases the Hydra resistance of opponents, and this constellation especially will increase the duration of your burst by 3 seconds, which gives you more damage and more Hydra application, making him an even better support to whatever reaction-based team you are running. Your C3 and 5 are honestly underrated, especially your C3. Increasing your burst talent levels by 3 are insane. C4 is kind of whatever, but it increases your skill damage if you use it in your burst. And then your C6 is one of the most broken constellations. Such a big DPS increase to Xingqiu, because with this constellation, basically every 3 hits, you'll now shoot out 5 rain swords. So instead of just shooting 2 to 3, it'll shoot 2 and then 3 and then 5, which will increase your damage and also make him an even better hydro applier for pyro units. Now, before we get into more specialized constellations, right, that I think are super essential for certain characters that not everyone needs to use, but that some people want to, the last 2 characters that are used by pretty much everyone and that can fit so many team comps are Sucrose and Fischl, who both have a few crucial constellations. While Sucrose is not constellation dependent by any means, her C1 can be very good in certain teams. While it's just good overall for more particles and for helping you displace enemies, it's especially good if you need the particles, let's say in a Xiao team. If you pair him with a Sucrose who has her first constellation, being able to give him that many more particles will allow him to get his burst back on cooldown a lot easier and can therefore be a very nice constellation to have. Although it isn't as big of a deal as some other constellations, it can be very, very nice depending on your team. And regarding Fischl, she's another character who just has really good constellations overall. Now, the reason I want to talk about Fischl here is because I think Fischl is a character that a lot of people use, and I recommend in a lot of different teams, a lot of different team comps that can utilize Electro supports. And she is definitely someone who, as I'm sure you know, gains a lot of value from her 6th constellation. Now, I know I keep saying that I try to focus on earlier constellations, but with someone like Fischl, it's like she does have a few good early constellations like 2 and 3, but her 6th is such a big DPS increase and is the main one you should be going for because it'll increase your Oz's duration by 2 seconds and also make him deal way more damage by doing joint attacks with your active character, which will deal 30% of your Fischl's attack as electro damage, and this obviously will scale with your Fischl stats, making it deal a lot of damage. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this C6 is because since I think Fischl is such a universal support, who while she doesn't fit every team, she typically fits every account, like most accounts want her in at least one team. I do think it's one of the constellations that you should be going for passively because pretty much whenever Fischl's right up on a banner, it's something that I'm happy about and makes the banner typically a bit more worth it if you are trying to go for that 6th constellation, which will greatly increase your Fischl's DPS as a support, making Oz like a secondary DPS, really, really good in like a taser team or in pretty much any team that you can fit her in. Now, with that being said, those are the more general like support constellations that I recommend. Now, for some other very specific constellations that are very good, but a bit more niche, and what I mean by that is for characters that maybe not everyone's using, like let's say Ningguang. Ningguang has some really good constellations, like her 2nd one and her 6th one, which make her a much better carry, but Ningguang is also not a character that everyone is going to use. If you do plan on using her as a DPS or a burst support, I do highly recommend going for the 2nd constellation because it will give you a lot more damage, resetting the cooldown of your Jade screen when it's shattered, and you can shatter it by using your burst typically, and I go over this in my Ningguang guide, but you use your skill and then your burst, and then if you have your 2nd constellation, you can use your skill again, and your skill has a very high scaling, so this 2nd constellation is obviously very good. Also, regarding your 1st constellation on Ningguang, I think this one's kind of overrated. It gives you some AoE, but the enemies do have to be very close to each other, so this is a good constellation, but typically the C2 is what I recommend the most, other than obviously your 6th constellation, which is a lot harder to get, but very, very good for a main DPS Ningguang, giving you 7 Star Jades after you use your burst, allowing you to then use your charge attack after your burst, which will deal a lot more damage because of those Jades. And so yeah, C2 and C6 honestly are really, really good, and definitely what you should go for if you do use Ningguang as your main DPS. Another constellation I want to talk about is Rosaria's. Her C2, in my opinion, is really, really nice because it increases your burst duration by 4 seconds, giving her more potential as a cryo support since you'll be applying cryo for longer and, you know, dealing damage for longer, making your burst a lot better than it typically is. I think Rosaria's burst in general is very good. I think Rosaria as a character in general is very good, even at C0, but her C2 will just make this duration go from 8 seconds to 10 seconds, giving her less downtime and giving you obviously more procs of your Ice Lance, increasing her potential overall. Now, once again, since we are entering the more like niche zone where it's, I recommend everyone who plays these characters go for these constellations, but not everyone needs them, I do have to talk about someone like Chongyun, where if you are using Chongyun, I highly suggest getting your 2nd constellation because this is what makes them even more viable in my opinion, makes them a stronger option, giving you a cooldown reduction to any ability used inside of his elemental skill, which is that cryo field that lasts quite a while, making him, in my opinion, a much stronger cryo support than without the 2nd constellation. Similarly, someone like Kaya, whose constellations are very hard to get, so that does suck, but you can get them in the Star Glitter shop, which is why I feel like it's worth mentioning, because if you do see him in the Star Glitter shop, it might be worth picking up his constellations, especially if that Star Glitter lets you get one of his first constellations, especially his 2nd one. Honestly, your 2nd constellation is just really nice, especially if you're fighting multiple enemies, increasing the duration of your burst every time you defeat an opponent by 2.5 seconds up to a maximum of 15. And so this can be very good, a bit situational, but as long as you're defeating enemies pretty fast, a very good constellation. Your C1's also nice if you run Kaya as a main DPS, mainly in a freeze team, and I think Kaya is a very good freeze carry, giving you crit rate to your normal and charge attacks against opponents affected by cryo by 15%. Lastly, a constellation that I would honestly be upset at myself if I didn't mention is a constellation that I think makes this character a lot more fun and less clunky in her playstyle, and that is Sara's second constellation. While Sara is once again a more niche character, I do think that her second constellation unlocks a lot of her potential because it will allow you to get that attack buff from her elemental skill without even having to do a charge shot after, which is the clunky part of her kit, although it's still typically recommended to do a charge shot so that you gain the electro particles that only come from you using the charge shot on your Sara. However, having the second constellation unlocks more potential, allows you to gain another attack buff. Basically, I guess I didn't really read the second constellation. I'm kind of just moving really fast, but effectively when you use your skill, it leaves another crow feather at Sara's position, which is the part of your elemental skill that will buff the party member that's inside of it. It will deal less damage and won't give you particles, which is the downside, but it still gives you the full attack buff that is on your elemental skill, which is the main reason you're using Sara without even having to do that charge shot. For someone like Sayu, your fourth and sixth constellation can be very nice. Fourth one giving you more energy when you swirl, very good for Sayu who can be energy hungry, and your sixth will give you just a lot more benefits from elemental mastery, encouraging you to stack that on her even more. For Razor, while he doesn't have any needed constellations, your C1 giving you more damage and your C4 decreasing the defense of opponents are very good and highly recommended for a main DPS Razor. And lastly, if you want to play Noelle as a main DPS, your C6 is honestly huge. It unlocks so much of your potential, making you scale even more with your defense during your burst. Your attack will be increased by your defense, changing your build completely, making you want to stack more defense on your artifacts and giving you a lot more damage. On top of extending your duration, right? Every opponent defeated during your skill's duration, your burst, will increase it by 1 second, adding up to 10 seconds to your burst duration. Also, while Yanfei isn't a constellation dependent character at all, her C1 is a very nice quality of life increase, reducing the charge attack stamina by 10% for every seal that you have around you, for a maximum of obviously 3 seals or 4 with your 6th constellation. And while this constellation isn't needed, it's definitely my favorite one in terms of quality of life for Yanfei and can make managing stamina a bit easier. Initially, I was planning on just talking about the most essential constellations, but I think also having a section of best constellations for the 4 stars in case you do want them is a good thing to mention. And I feel like it will help more people who just want to, have more content or are wondering certain questions without having to go watch like a 20-minute guide, or for people who are just wondering like what the best constellation for their main is, or for a character that they're trying to build. Now, while I mentioned it in the intro, I did only cover 4-star characters in this video because I can't recommend everyone to go get 5-star constellations. Although if you do want to know which 5-star constellations are the best, you can watch my specific guide for those 5-star characters. The only constellation, honestly, that I recommend to pretty much everyone if you do have the spare Primo Gems, and obviously most people don't, but I do think Hu Tao's C1 is probably the most important 5-star C1 in the game, making her just way more fun to play and just deal more damage because you can spend your stamina offensively. And so it's both a quality of life constellation and a DPS increase, and very quickly other very good 5-star constellations. And I can make a separate video on this if you guys want it, but other very good early game constellations for 5 stars include Eula's C1 for massive DPS increase, Raiden's C2 reducing the defense of opponents, obviously making her deal more damage as well, Kazua's C1 resetting the skill cooldown after your burst, and C2 giving a bunch of elemental mastery to him and his team. Albeido's C2 not being needed, but kind of solving his split scaling, making your burst deal more damage based on your defense. So if he's a character you use a lot, C2, also C1 in certain teams can both be very useful, with C2 giving you obviously more DPS from your burst. Ganyu has an amazing C1 as well, decreasing cryo resistance of opponents. Ayaka, while her C1 isn't great, she has a very good C2. Can be somewhat inconsistent because the 2 bursts that it summons can miss, but if you do hit them, they're very strong. And then her constellations also can get better with like her C3 being okay and her C4 being great, but I don't really want to get too deep on the constellation list. Klee also has a very good C2 for certain comps and just in general because it decreases the defense of opponents. And I've seen a lot of people use Klee this way, even just as a support or in like one-shot teams. But in general, those are the main ones I just wanted to mention as the ones I can think of as being very essential. Obviously, I could talk about every single 5-star if you guys want to, but I feel like a lot of the times they're not really worth it. Like Kokomi's Kokomi, and even with constellations, like that won't change it. And there's some that are quality of life ones like Child C1, but it isn't something that really increases your DPS all that much. It's more of a quality of life increase, to where those aren't the ones that I want to mention or recommend in this video. But again, if you guys want a separate video on 5 stars specifically, it is something that I am open to, so you can leave suggestions regarding that. With that being said, I really hope you enjoyed. If there's anything I want to add, any constellation I forgot, because I am human, I will put it in a pinned comment, so be sure to check that. I really hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to thumbs up, leave a comment. If there's any feedback, questions, I do read most of them. Feel free to join the Discord, subscribe, follow me on Twitch, all that stuff. With that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.